Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, folks, so continuing with our series that we've been doing lately on the most influential cars of each decade, we have left the 1930s, the Great Depression is over, now it is the 1940s, World War II is afoot, and the Allies are making their advances on the Axis powers in Europe and in the Pacific. But what is going on back home with car production? What is going on in the world in general with car production? So, this segment, or not this segment, this podcast is going to be talking about the most influential car of the 1940s. And dare I say, it is the Volkswagen Beetle. Yeah, folks, this is undoubtedly one of the most influential cars of all time, but definitely the most influential car of the 1940s. The Volkswagen Beetle is something of a legend that I don't think will ever be forgotten in recent memory. So let's get started. In segment one, we are going to be discussing, of course, the history of the Volkswagen Beetle and what it was known for, what it did. In segment 2, we're going to be discussing the specifications. In segment 3, we're going to be discussing some of the other cars that existed at the time, as well as history of the time period. And then in segment 4, you're going to be hearing my thoughts on the Volkswagen Beetle. So let's get started. As you all know, I already mentioned the Volkswagen Beetle in a much smaller series earlier in this whole podcast stint that I've been doing. I did it on beloved European economy cars of old. And then the first part of that series was the Volkswagen Beetle versus the BMC Mini. And the Volkswagen Beetle was the one that I chose as far as the one that I preferred in that standoff. So here goes nothing. Here we are. We got the Volkswagen Beetle. It was officially called the Volkswagen Type 1, and it was built from 1938 to 2003. Get this. 21,529,464 original Volkswagen Beetles were made. That is almost 22 million cars. This holds the record for the longest running and most manufactured automobile on a single platform in a single body style ever made. And knowing how the modern automobile industry is, that's probably a record that will not be beaten. This car was made largely unchanged from 1938 to 2003. That's 65 years, a lifetime in some cases. That's insane. I don't know a person on earth today that, that hasn't been alive during a year when a Volkswagen Beetle was new. Be it the original Beetle or be it the Beetle that came afterward, everybody that I know of has been alive while Volkswagen Beetles have been produced. You would have had to be like Like, that's crazy. Like, you would have had to have been born before 1938, in which I guess it's not fair to say that, but I guess nobody alive today knows the time in which the Volkswagen Beetle was not produced or something like that. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say. Point is, it's impacted everybody on Earth today. Everybody knows what it is. Everybody's seen one. Everybody's known someone who's had one. I've known several people who've had Volkswagen Beetles. Old ones, new ones, the most recent ones. I've known somebody with a Volkswagen Beetle. So point is, it's impacted the world. It is a world car, truly. It was designed by Bela Baranyi, and then the design was finished off by Ferdinand Porsche. Bela Baranyi actually sued Ferdinand Porsche and Volkswagen for copyright infringement because it was proven in a court case in 1955, actually, that he was the original designer of the car, and that Ferdinand Porsche, though he has been credited with the design of the car, only brought that design to its final form. He did not draw the most basic first design of it. So Bela Baranyi successfully sued both Volkswagen and Ferdinand Porsche for essentially stealing his idea and passing it off someone else's. It was the brainchild of Adolf Hitler, who wanted a cheap car to be mass-produced for use on Germany's new roads. He called it the people's car. In German, Volkswagen, or Volkswagen, the wagon of the folks. That's basically what the Volkswagen is. And the Volkswagen Beetle basically took Henry Ford's idea of giving a car to the people and then injected it with steroids. And then this is what they came up with. This is, oh my goodness, it's insane. Like, Hitler had very specific, I guess, it's very specific goals for the automobile. It had to be able to seat 2 adults and 3 children. It had to be able to cruise on the Autobahn at 100 kilometers per hour, which is 62 miles per hour. It had to be able to be worked on by anybody, and the parts had to be easily removable and easily replaced. It had to be air-cooled because in those days, antifreeze was not being used on automobile engines. Antifreeze, like ethylene glycol and antifreeze sort of thing, was being used in like very, very high-end experimental airplane engines. It was not being used in car engines. In those days, if you had a car, you had to fill up your radiator with water, and if it was winter and the water would freeze, you had to drain it out every day so the water wouldn't freeze inside of your radiator, expand, and cause it to crack or whatever. I mean, these were the days before antifreeze. So Hitler was like, not every doctor has a garage that he can work on his car in. Essentially saying that we need to make the car simple enough that anybody can work on it and anybody can operate it and anybody can do basic maintenance on it. And I mean, I'm not saying Hitler was a good person. He definitely wasn't. But this was a great idea. And people will not soon forget this. It was designed in the 1930s, but it entered civilian production in the 1940s because of World War II. So this is why I chose to say it was the most influential car of the 1940s, not the 1930s, and not the 1960s in which it hit its heyday in America. But the 1940s, because this was a decade that the Volkswagen Beetle became, a people's car. It became a civilian's car, essentially. There were military versions of it, but it became a civilian's car. The platform spawned a number of variants, including the Volkswagen Bus and the Karmann Ghia. Both of those were built on the same platform as the Volkswagen Beetle. So now, if we're going to take into account how many cars were built on the same platform, not just how many were specifically Beetles, we're probably pushing 30-something million. It's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, they produced so many Volkswagen Beetles that there are countries that, the number of Volkswagen Beetles would outnumber the number of people if they put all of them in that same country. For example, you take a country like Haiti. Haiti has about 14, 15 million people. You could give every single Haitian living in Haiti today a Volkswagen Beetle and still have about 8 million cars left over. That's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. They made about 23 million of them. Let's say Haiti has about 15 million people. You would still have 8 million cars left over. If every single Asian man, woman, child, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, if every single one of them got a Volkswagen Beetle, there would be still 8 million cars left over to be distributed. That's just to put it in perspective. If you were to populate a country solely based off of Volkswagen Beetles, it would be almost 23 million people. The UK, for perspective, has about 33 million people. So, yeah, comparable in size. That's crazy. That is absolutely crazy. The final iteration of the flat 4 air-cooled engine of the Volkswagen Beetle had around 40 horsepower, and it spawned a great cult following. Not just the engine, but the car itself. The hippie movement in the 1960s, the dune buggy versions that they made of this car that people would take and modify them. They've hot rodded them. I mean, Herbie Fully Loaded. There was a movie. There's all sorts of things related to the Volkswagen Beetle. Like I said, there's not a person alive today whose life has not been touched in some way by the Volkswagen Beetle. Unless you're a native tribes person living in the jungles of the Amazon, you've heard of the Volkswagen Beetle. Anybody who's had contact with the outside world, I can guarantee it, has seen one of these, has heard about it, has come across one of them. They're just that common. They built them in like over 20 different places and factories around the world. It was crazy. It faced stiff competition in the 1970s and the 1980s against Japanese econoboxes. Basically, what had happened was it had gotten to a time where the rear engine, rear wheel drive, air-cooled setup wasn't really working for Volkswagen so much anymore. That being said, they kind of got to a point where there were cars that were more modern, that were more reliable, that were more practical, and more mainstream for everyday use, that end up slowly but surely taking over, especially here in the American market. So that's what ended up happening. I mean, eventually it got to a point that sales begun to decline. But get this, sales were still strong, even in 2003 as the last one rolled off the Mexican assembly line, the plant that they had in Mexico. Man, what an emotional moment that would have been for the last Volkswagen Beetle to roll off of the assembly line. Number 21,529,464. That's incredible. What a moment it would have been to finally see the Volkswagen Beetle reach the end of its time and to be at the factory, to be the last person who installed the last nut on the last bolt of the last Volkswagen Beetle. Man, goodness, that is a badge of honor. Just to know that they had seen this car off in such a fashionable place. In fact, they said that the Mexican workers at the factory in Mexico had a fanfare, and I believe a mariachi band, goodness, if I'm not mistaken, for the last Volkswagen Beetle when it rolled off the assembly line. So there you have it. I don't know if that's an urban legend or if it actually happened. But yeah, so more modern, more water-cooled engines officially ended production in 2003 in Mexico. The new Beetle, however, is a different car based on the design of this one. It originally started out as a concept car, then they put it into production, and frankly, it was more of a modern novelty than itself. I would not include the new Beetle as one of the most influential cars on Earth. It's just a car. It's a novelty, really. I guess it was technically an economy car, but really by this time, the Volkswagen Golf had taken over that title as economy car from Volkswagen. So yeah, the Volkswagen Golf was your economy car, your hot hatchback, if you got like the Golf R or whatever they called it. I mean, it was the Golf that was really the economy car, and then the new Beetle, which was built on the same platform as the Golf, was like the novelty version of that. So there you have it. That's just a brief history on the Volkswagen Beetle. But I thought I should give it to you, and then please stay tuned for the next segment in which we are going to be discussing the specifications of the Volkswagen Beetle. So please stay tuned.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So here we have segment 2 of the podcast on the most influential car of the 1940s, which is the Volkswagen Beetle. Let's get started. In segment 1, we discussed the history, so this time we're going to discuss a little bit more of the history because there's just so much history, and then the specifications of the Volkswagen Beetle. So over the course of its multi-generational history, that's all it can be called, multi-generations. I mean, the Volkswagen Beetle was always powered by an air-cooled rear-mounted flat four engine. That's what it was. That was basically the engine that was the most economical, the most practical, and the easiest produced to put into the car. Really, nothing else really would have worked. If you had gone lower than 4 cylinders, the car would have been grossly underpowered. And if you had gone more than 4 cylinders, then the car would have had to be redesigned in order to accommodate an engine that was that large. So 4 cylinders really what was the best choice for the Volkswagen Beetle. It started out as a 1.1 liter, then it went to a 1.2 liter, then it went to a 1.3 liter, and get this, a 1.5 liter, it skipped 1.4, and then it finally ended as a 1.6 liter. So not too much interesting going on in the engine department, as you can see. It always had a manual or semi-automatic transmission. The Beetle was about 13.4 feet long and 5 feet wide. That is absolutely minuscule by today's car standards. Like, if you see cars from old version and then see cars today, cars have steadily gotten bulkier. And, honestly, I have to take a segue into this. I feel like history is repeating itself. You see, the car started off as something very small. In the 20s, cars had gotten very large, and they had stayed really large up until probably the 70s. So from like the 20s to the 70s, for a good 50 years, cars were really big. And then in the 80s, cars started to get small again. And then in the 90s, they were still kind of small. And then in the early 2000s, they were still kind of small. And then in the 2010s, cars started growing again. And now cars are getting a lot larger. And it's like when you take the Volkswagen old Beetle, or the original Beetle that we're discussing as the most influential car of the 1940s, and when you take it versus a tradition, like a real, not a real, they're all real, but a new Beetle, like the ones that came out the last year in 2019, it's huge compared to the original one. I mean, the original one could seat conceivably 5 people, but more practically 4 people. I mean, the new ones now, you could seat 4 or 5 people comfortably and then stretch your legs. Granted, it's not a huge car, but like you got good headroom, you got everything. I mean, the old Volkswagen Beetle wasn't like that. The old Volkswagen Beetle was a cramped car. I mean, granted, it was well designed, but compared by modern standards, definitely a cramped automobile. So just to think of it and put it into perspective, 13.4 feet long and only 5 feet wide. It's crazy. Bela Barenyi is credited with conceiving the original design of this car way back in 1925. As you all had heard in the last segment, he sued Ferdinand Porsche, and Porsche is considered the designer and the one who brought it into production, but he wasn't. He has been since discredited, and the credit, namely on the Mercedes-Benz website, actually, it's Bela Barenyi that is considered the designer of the Volkswagen Beetle. In May 1934. Now, here's the more specific story on this that I had told you about what Hitler had said. Hitler insisted on a basic vehicle that can transport 2 adults and 3 children at 100 kilometers per hour while not using more than 7 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers per hour. Now, transfer that into customary units. 100 kilometers per hour is 62 miles per hour, and then 7 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers is 32 miles per gallon. So get this. He was basically saying that the car had to be practical, it had to be fast enough to cruise on the Autobahn, it had to be a gas sipper, and it had to do all of those at the same time. That is crazy. That is crazy. But he did it. Or at least, not he did it, but he got what he wanted. Volkswagen did it. And the engine also had to be powerful enough to be sustained cruising on the Autobahn. You already heard that. So parts had to be easily replaceable and inexpensive. It had to be air-cooled because, as you know, not every doctor has his own garage. And he named it the Kraft durch Freudewagen, meaning the strength through joy car. If any of you all out there are German speakers, please forgive me for my atrocious pronunciation, but that's what it was. So Kraft durch Freudewagen, meaning the strength through joy car. Now get this. The Volkswagen, obviously, was not the first car to have this people's mentality. The people's car had been a thing for a while now. But he was the one who really brought the people's car to Europe. Because, mind you, Henry Ford had already, conceived of a people's car in the United States that is known as the Ford Model T, which was the most influential car of the 1900s or the 1910s or something that I had said. But now, here you have the Volkswagen in Europe. Europe is a much different place. The average German at the time could not afford a car because German cars at this time were still largely luxurious and reserved for the richest and the wealthiest people in society. These were not cars that little Bertha could grow up and, be a secretary and then say, yes, I'm going to afford a car. No. Little Bertha would have been just dreaming. Oh, pardon me. Little Bertha would have been just dreaming. I mean, she would have been like, I want to own a Mercedes-Benz. Absolutely not. But little Bertha could own a Volkswagen Beetle by the time it came out because this was a car that was supposed to be affordable for the common person. Hitler wanted to get, a car in the hands of the people, and he wanted to connect the country through roads, and by gosh darn it, be it good or be it bad that it was Hitler who did it, he did it. And he got the German people on the road. And not only did he get the German people on the road, he got half the world on the road through his idea of this Volkswagen Beetle. I mean, it's sort of a morbid history almost that one of the most despised and hated people of all time who have ever lived would would be the person behind one of the most loved and admired and cherished cars that has ever been produced, like the Volkswagen Beetle. And it's certainly one of the most influential. It's a weird juxtaposition there. But just to drive my point home on the Volkswagen Beetle, this was genuinely amazing at the time period. There was a time in which, cars in Europe, only 2.6% of them were rear-wheel drive, rear-engined, air-cooled cars. By the time the Volkswagen Beetle had sold in Europe, in 10 years of its production, shifted that statistic from 2.6% to 26.6%. 26.6% of cars in Western Europe were rear-engined, air-cooled, rear-wheel drive cars. Why of the big shift? Because of the Volkswagen Beetle. This is what it means to be the Volkswagen Beetle. You had the potential to shift trends to sway, things in society that would not have been swayable. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy that this was such a successful idea. Granted, it's not like the idea was a bad idea. It's just that it was executed with such efficiency, and it was so well done and well built and well made. I mean, you still see Volkswagen Beetles every now and then. Granted, they're not fast, and a lot of them have seen better days, but they still run. And they're popular amongst first-time classic car owners. It spawned not only, I guess, an economy car war in Europe between so many different car manufacturers. It also spawned a culture. It spawned a culture. It spawned a cult culture of the Volkswagen Beetle and people who loved it. It spawned so many different, it's hard to explain what the impact the Volkswagen Beetle had on modern car society. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful. Seeing everything that came of it, it was a work of art. And it was a car, and people made art with it, and people still include it in so many different projects and other sorts of things. I mean, they've done everything with this thing that you can possibly think of. I've seen people chop off the roofs and turn them into convertibles. I've seen people jack them up and turn them into dune buggies. I've seen people, put large engines in them and drift them. I've seen people do all sorts of things with the Volkswagen Beetle. People can literally never get tired of this vehicle. You can never get tired of it. And boy, has it left its mark. I was so extremely sad when I heard that Volkswagen was killing off the Volkswagen Beetle in 2019. It wasn't a smart move. It wasn't a smart move, but I understand why it was done. It was time to put the Beetle to rest, or maybe they were doing it just to bring it back as an electric version. I mean, heck, they said they were going to bring back the Volkswagen bus in an electric version in 2022. So maybe off of that platform, we might find an electric Beetle. But it was just, the Volkswagen Beetle was definitely something. I mean, it went by so many nicknames. It went by so many different terms. As kids, we used to play the little punch buggy, no punchbacks game on the school bus heading to and from school. If you saw Volkswagen Beetle, you would say, red punch buggy, no punchbacks if it was red, and you would just, punch your friend in the arm. I mean, it's just, man, it's part of our childhoods. It's part of our childhood. Granted, by the time the Volkswagen Beetle, the original Beetle, left production, I was in kindergarten, so I wasn't even old enough to have a car. But I'm pretty sure at that time I had still known what a Volkswagen Beetle was, because it's impossible to not know what it is, especially if you lived in a developed country. It's impossible to not have seen these little cars and not have known what they were capable of doing and not had heard of the idea behind them to unite Germany under one, road system and to ensure that everybody was able to have a car because it was cheap and inexpensive to maintain. I don't think they could have known that it was going to blow up the way it blew up. Blow up in a good way, that is. I don't think they would have known that it would have blown up into so many different cultures, into so many different aspects of people's language. I mean, it's crazy. I know I say it's crazy, but the Volkswagen Beetle is forever cemented in our brains. Probably, if not the most influential car of all time, definitely the most memorable car of all time. You cannot forget that. We all have a collective conscience, and the Volkswagen Beetle is sitting on the throne of that collective conscience. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. If someone doesn't know it, then they're an alien, I swear. I mean, if someone doesn't know what a Volkswagen Beetle is, they're an alien and they come from a different planet. If you live on planet Earth and you've lived in a society, in any country, in any city, you would know what a Volkswagen Beetle is. It would be impossible for you to not know. Well-built, well-engineered, reliable, and cheap and easy to mass-produce. That is what made the Volkswagen Beetle so very influential. So moving on, segment 3, we're going to be talking about some other cars of the time period as well as some of the history that was going on. So please stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome to segment 3, folks. So here we are. We've discussed segment 1, the history of the Volkswagen Beetle. Segment 2, we've discussed the specifications and some more history of the Volkswagen Beetle. And of course, I had to go off on a tangent because that's what I do. And then now it's segment 3. So we're going to take a little break from the Volkswagen Beetle, even though I will probably mention it again. But we're going to talk about some other cars that existed during this time period, as well as some of the world history that was going on to really shape the decade and really how it affected the car market. I don't do this for no reason. There's a reason why I include these events is because, some of these events are just fun facts, but some of them actually had an effect on economies, on countries, and these things have effects on car culture and car production. So let's get started. The predecessor to all modern Jeeps was the Willys Overland CJ, or the Willis Overland CJ, however you want to pronounce it. This was the predecessor to all modern Jeeps, especially the Wrangler. It was based on the Willis MB, which was the military Jeep. And what they had done, they had made a civilian version of it, of course, without gun turrets and other sorts of military spec things. But they had made a civilian version of it that would go on in pretty much a direct lineage from then until now with the current Jeep Wrangler. There is an unbroken line of succession from the Willis MB, which was the military Jeep, Jeep to the Willis Overland CJ, and then to the AMC Jeeps, and then to the Chrysler era of Jeeps as it stands today. Unbroken line of succession. So that is definitely an influential vehicle. And I was actually thinking about doing the podcast on this one. I was thinking about doing the podcast on this car simply because I figured that the Volkswagen Beetle could wait and that we could do it for the 1960s decade. But then there was another car, and you'll find out when that decade comes around. But there was another car that, you know, that was from the 60s, that was a child of the 60s. I couldn't take the Volkswagen Beetle. That was really a 40s car that made it big and continued through the 60s instead of a product of the 60s itself. So I decided to do the Volkswagen Beetle in the 40s, so therefore the Willis Overland had to take a backseat into segment 3, which is just being basically mentioned as an honorable mention to a subject of the podcast. There was a Cadillac Series 62. The Cadillac Series 62 of this time period, especially the mid to late 40s, was famous for its early tail fins, designed by Harley Earl, one of the most influential American car designers. Cadillacs still have tail fins today. And I know some people will be like, no, they don't. Yeah, they do, though. Look at a Cadillac, especially a car like an XTS or an SRX. Look at it from the rear quarter panel view and angle your head a little bit, or angle your point of view actually a little bit. You can actually see where the fender sticks up a little bit and where the tail light sticks up and protrudes from the bodywork. Tail fin. It all started with Harley Earl. This sparked a trend like no other, to the point where it got to the point where there was tail fins that were like, we're talking about 5-6 inches off the body of the car, like in the case of the 1959 Cadillac, and you know, any cars that share that same body style. Then it trickled to other car manufacturers. Some Chrysler Windsors had huge tail fins. Buicks had giant delta fins in the the 1959 model year, especially with the Electra 225, the LeSabre, the Wildcat. I mean, all of those cars, 59 Buick, huge wings, all of them. All of these wings that you see on cars of old, all started by Harley Earl, man. All started by Harley Earl. He is the father of the tail fin on a car. What a strange style to have, but he is the father of the tail fin. You cannot mention tail fins and the history of which they happened without mentioning Harley Earl. It's impossible to have a thorough view of what that old thing was like. And then you had the Oldsmobile Rocket 88. I had mentioned the Oldsmobile Rocket 88 in my podcast on what is a muscle car. The Oldsmobile Rocket 88 is a muscle car of a very early breed. What I had defined a muscle car as was a full-size car made in America with a large displacement engine and a lighter, smaller, and a large displacement engine. Not a lighter, smaller body. That would have been a pony car. So basically a large full-size car with a large displacement engine tuned for performance, specifically straight-line speed, and perfectly suited to drag racing. And the Oldsmobile Rocket 88 was it. It debuted in 1949, largely regarded as the world's first muscle car. It was the first powerful V8 offered in a smaller and lighter body style, yet it was still full size, and launched the era of the high-performance V8 as well as the era of the muscle car, the Oldsmobile Rocket 88. In fact, hot rodders of the day were not sodding. What was I saying? The Volkswagen, not the Volkswagen, the Oldsmobile Rocket 88, its engine was so desirable that it was highly sought after of hot rodders of the day to put into their own projects because of how powerful it was, how reliable it was, and how many horsepower it made. That's what mattered to those people, and frankly, that's what does matter when it comes to a muscle car. So that was the Oldsmobile Rocket 88. So moving on, as far as history goes, 1939 to 1945, it's World War II, one of the bloodiest wars in all of history. Such events included the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, as FDR said in his speech that day. Hitler's invasion of Poland, the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were slaughtered, essentially, by Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany. The vast majority were held in concentration camps throughout Europe. Many died of diseases like typhoid. I think that was what killed Anne Frank and her sister, Margot. They were both killed by typhoid fever, I believe. And then, just unspeakable crimes against humanity, a Holocaust, a genocide. It was absolutely horrible. But yeah, that was in and around the time of World War II. Mahatma Gandhi, it was killed in 1948 by Nathuram Godse, and the Atanasoff Berry computer is the first electronic digital computing device built by John Vincent Atanasoff and Clifford Berry at Iowa State University from 1937 to 1942. So first computer with a digital output essentially was built during this time period as well. And just to tie it all into cars, really, what had happened during the 1940s? There was what was called pre-war design and post-war design in cars. You see, when World War II had broken out, especially in the United States, because the United States was originally not getting involved in the war. It was going to stay neutral. But after the Japanese decided to pull a fast one and bomb Pearl Harbor, it forced the U.S. to enter the war. Well, in order to fund the war effort, car manufacturers were commissioned to manufacture either pieces for airplanes or for other military vehicles that were going to be used in combat on the ground in the places that were going to be, taken over or whatnot. So what had happened was car manufacturers had ceased producing cars for those years, and then therefore had ceased designing cars and ceased doing a lot of things that was being done or that were being done at the end of, the decade before. I mean, this is what we call the post-war and the pre-war phenomenon. So, for example, let's say you have, a Ford. A Ford might still exist in that same generation, but there is a pre-war and a post-war design. It shows you that they were really committed to not producing cars, producing machinery to stop this war, and then cars came after. And so some of the technology trickled down into the cars from, things that they had seen in other countries, other sorts of things, just to modernize the cars, because eventually it would get to that point where the cars had begun to just get old and they were after going to be scrapped altogether. But this was basically what the pre-war cars were. So yeah, that is some of the other things that were going on in the world at the time. Volkswagen at this time wasn't the company that it was now. It wasn't the giant that it is now. So Volkswagen essentially, with the Beetle, I should say, Volkswagen, that was the start of Volkswagen. It was the Beetle. And at first, it was called simply the Volkswagen. It only got the name Type 1 later on when they started making other types. And they're like, this is the first one, so therefore it must be a Type 1. I mean, or I guess, that's really what it was. I guess technically it had always been a Type 1, but nobody called it that. People just called it simply the Volkswagen because it was the wagon of the folks. And yeah, it was something. It was definitely something. And yeah, absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. The Volkswagen Beetle. Yeah. I guess that's what I have to say. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to end abruptly or anything. It's just, the thing is, the Volkswagen Beetle had its history. It's had its history during this time period. And it was great. It was great. It was what the people wanted, and it gave them what they wanted. So please stay tuned for the last segment, in which I'm going to discuss my thoughts and some of the other things about the Volkswagen Beetle. So please stay tuned.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So this is segment 4 of the podcast, in which we are going to be discussing my personal thoughts on the Volkswagen Beetle. The Volkswagen Beetle was quite something. But before I give you my personal thoughts, the Beetle would go on to influence so many different cars. And this segment would not be justified if I didn't tell you how many cars it would go on to influence before I gave you my personal thoughts. The Chevrolet Corvair was inspired by the Bugs layout and the rear suspension architecture, because Chevrolet had seen successful rear-wheel drive, rear-engine, air-cooled engine car. We're going to make one of those too. Not nearly as successful as the Volkswagen Beetle. And frankly, it was deemed as dangerous at any speed, which we know now wasn't exactly dangerous. It's just people didn't really know how to handle the car properly. But, a fair number of Corvairs did end up flipping over. So, they tried, but they didn't do it as well. But nonetheless, it was inspired by the Volkswagen Beetle. With the advent of the Beetle, like I said earlier, in 1946, 2.6% of continental West Europe cars were rear-wheel drive and rear-engine layout. In 1956, 10 years later, 26.6 were rear-wheel drive, layout, and rear engine, and this was a trend led by Volkswagen, and then it was canceled, or what does that say? It was counseled? I'm sorry. I'm looking at my notes here, and I can't realize what I'm saying. It was continued. Continued by Fiat and Renault. Oh, goodness. I'm sorry. That's kind of embarrassing. I'm reading my notes, and I can't even read what it says. But yeah, the Volkswagen should have never stopped production. That's bad marketing, honestly. It's bad marketing on Volkswagen's part. You get a car that is as famous as the Volkswagen Beetle, and then you're going to get to a point where you're just going to be like, I'm tired of it, we're just going to stop selling it. At that point, if people aren't buying it, you reinvigorate it. They really could have, made an electric version of it. Heck, even a hybrid version of it. If you had done an electric version of the Volkswagen Beetle, my goodness, people would eat it up. I think what they should have done, frankly, with the Volkswagen Beetle, is that they should have discontinued the gas-powered version and then introduced a new generation of it as a fully electric vehicle that was slotted against the Tesla Model 3 as an efficient, affordable, people's electric car. It didn't necessarily have to have the goofy styling. Of course, it would be much more modern in styling, but still keeping some of those traditional lines, so it's still recognizably a Beetle. But it should be an electric car that is cheap enough to produce, especially by such a large company, in order to eat away at Tesla's Model 3 sales. Because I can just tell you now, it's probably going to be better than a Tesla. Because Tesla, I don't care if Elon Musk is the richest man on earth and he hears this, Tesla is a novelty. Tesla is not really here to stay. And Tesla, frankly, doesn't give me, confidence about its future. But, I mean, the Volkswagen would really, really drive that point home for so many people if they knew that they could have a practical, and if they could have basically what they needed in an automobile without the extra frills of something like Tesla, but only the fact that it was electric. I mean, yeah. So it was a brilliant original idea. I will say that. I will credit Bela Barendi for designing it, but as far as the person who commissioned it, it's none other than Adolf Hitler himself. Yeah, it was a great idea to stick it to the roof, or not to stick it to the roof, to have the Volkswagen Beetle be put into production. The Volkswagen Beetle deserves its recognition on the stage of car enthusiasts, on the stage of the car world. Yeah, I mean that's what we have to say about the Volkswagen Beetle. The Volkswagen Beetle is an original idea that was brilliant and that lived on in one form or another for, oh my gosh, from 1938 to 2019. 1938 to 2019, 81 years. The Volkswagen Beetle soldiered on as an automobile, be it an old Beetle, a new Beetle, a convertible Beetle, turbo Beetle, whatever you want to call it. It survived for that long. And, another thing that this brings to attention, cheap cars like this are really becoming a thing of the past. Nobody's buying Ford Pintos anymore. They're not making cars like the Ford Pinto anymore. Yeah, there's Ford Fiestas, but they've stopped making those. There's something a little charming about a really cheap car that you can buy brand new. You get cars like the Mitsubishi Mirage, which I guess they're still producing somehow, as terrible as it is. But the thing is, cheap cars are just not really being produced anymore. They really aren't, because everybody is being so demanding as to what equipment they want in their cars that it's almost impossible to market a cheap bare bones car like the Volkswagen Beetle nowadays. It's not really a viable option. People are not going to want to buy it. And it's sort of kind of sad, because these cars have their purpose. They have their place in society. And a lot of times, frankly, they were real quirky and people end up growing to love them. A cheap car is not really something you can buy every day. And that is done to the disadvantage of a lot of people, because a lot of people want something that is definitely going to run, well, and you don't have to keep on checking up on. And it's reliable. That's what people go for when they're buying a cheap car. I mean, it's just, because everybody wants luxury, and because what used to be a long list of luxury features are now being offered by standard equipment, it's like the days of the cheap car are steadily drawing to a close. The thing is, cheap cars need to have a place in the society for cheap people, frankly, or people who don't have that much money. That was a way for someone to get around that was a way for someone to be able to pay off a car payment that was, really bad, and then still getting, approved for credit and whatnot. I mean, it's just the Volkswagen Beetle, its essence, the cheap cars need to make a comeback. They need to make a comeback, especially in the world of EVs, when EVs are becoming more and more at hand, in your face, in the future. I mean, a cheap car then is definitely going to need to be produced in order to keep up with the demand for electric cars. And frankly, in order to keep up with the people who say, I want an electric car just so I can save gas, or because gas prices are going really high and I don't want to pay them, but I don't want that type of electric car. I don't like what he's doing to it, or something like that. I mean, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what the future holds with other cars that have not yet been conceived, and with some of the inner workings of what's going on. I mean, yeah, it's a sad thing. The Volkswagen Beetle is no more. Is no more. And cheap cars are no more either. So, yeah. I mean, of course, I should probably, end this podcast on a sort of somber note. Volkswagen Beetle, very, very great car, finally being brought to an end. And with it, it's taking a whole entire era and a whole entire culture away with it. And we were blessed most of our lives, especially people of my generation, to have seen the Volkswagen Beetle leave from what it used to be to what it is today. It is quite something. It is quite something. Yeah. So let me give you an update on what's going on in my car world, at least. As you all know, I've got a Buick Park Avenue Ultra. I got it fixed today. I tried changing the coolant temperature sensor myself. It didn't end up working. At least I tried myself, so I ended up taking it to a mechanic. He put on new tires, and he checked the thermostat, and he checked the coolant temperature sensor, and so far my car is going well. Today, on the way back from the mechanic shop, it hit 150,000 miles, and tomorrow I'm taking it up to Tennessee with my girlfriend. We're going to go visit her family for a week. So that's what's going on. That's what's going on in my car world, at least, in my car bubble, in my car life, whatever you want to call it. So that's what's been going on. And yeah, I mean, I'm going to definitely mention the road trip, how my car performs, and I'm definitely going to see if I can take lots of pictures and put them on social media, obviously car related, and anything interesting I see along the way. And please follow us on our Instagram account, which is the very reason why I am doing this podcast series in general, is to commemorate the beginning of our Instagram and to do a lot of things that, really needed to be done. Really, really needed to be done concerning the social media and whatnot. As of late, we've got about 48 followers and still counting. So please get the word out there. Talk to us or leave us a comment and talk to other people and see if they can subscribe and just listen, because that's what makes it all worth it. Educating the masses on the idea of cars and the different sorts of things about them. So please stay tuned for the next episode, which is going to be on the most influential car of the 1950s. I've already got one picked out. I'm not going to tell you. And yes, please stay tuned. And thank you so much for listening to this GSMC car podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I was your host, David Lucy Mabel. Thank you so much, and have a good night, folks.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.